Hello and welcome to PTV World's The Debate. I'm your host, Sana Maqbool. In today's show, we will be taking a look at two important stories. The first is with reference to the conditions in Pakistan relating to our economy, which unfortunately have seen a downward trend since quite a few days now. We have seen a dip in the stock exchange previously as well. And even now we have seen there has been more than 1,000 points dip in the stock exchange, which of course points towards the economy going towards a direction that nobody wants it to go. We also understand that the government's expected decision of removing fuel subsidies has not yet been announced, and what has been announced is with reference to the fuel prices remaining the same. However, the finance minister also spoke about the possibility of them changing anytime in the future according to the circumstances. But we also know that Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has talked about how this is not going to be acceptable to the people, and he does not want to make the changes which are required for the resumption of the loan program by the IMF as well. And increasing uncertainty towards government decision has affected the economic situation of the country, as well as the dollar prices, which have continued to increase for 5 consecutive days now and have also crossed the all-time high of 194. This, of course, points towards what really needs to be done and how immediately it needs to be done by the government, and what can be the measures that need to be taken right now so that the situation can be controlled. So we'll take a look at that in our first segment. Our second segment is going to focus on the situation in Palestine. There have been a lot of clashes since the Al-Aqsa compound was raided in Ramzan. We have seen that there has been an increase in atrocities by Israeli occupation forces in the area, and journalists have also been targeted in a recent attack. We've also seen that Ms. Shiri Abu Akla was also targeted by Israeli occupation forces. Even her funeral was also targeted by the Israeli police. Their flags removed, which is of course a scene that was troublesome and worrying for the entire community. However, we still did not see the kind of response that it warranted, and the situation continues to deteriorate in Palestine while the world looks over. So we're going to be talking about that also in our second segment with regards to what needs to be done about it and how this voice can be taken to the platforms where it will be actually heard. For this and more, I've been joined in the studios as always by Farrukh Pitafi and Raja Faisal. And for our first segment with regards to the economic situation of the country, I've been joined by Mr. Farrukh, who's an economist at the University of Oxford. Thank you very much, Mr. Farrukh, for being with us in the debate. I'll start with you, Mr. Farrukh. When we look at what is going on in Pakistan, of course, this is a major concern for everyone living here with reference to what is going on and the kind of economic situation we all have to deal with. The prices keep on increasing. We've seen an all-time high in the dollar prices as well. And then, of course, the stock market also keeps on dipping. This is of course worrisome, especially when we don't really see a decision coming out with reference to the IMF program or other measures that need to be taken by the government, and perhaps the uncertainty is also adding to the problems. What do you think is the trajectory that Pakistan is going towards, and what needs to be immediately done if we were to recover from this trend?
Thank you very much for having me on the show. You're absolutely right. What we are facing right now is a lot of uncertainty around the economic decision making in the direction Pakistan will take. I think there's very little disagreement among most people what has to be done. The first thing has to be done is that the fuel subsidies have to be eliminated effectively. It's 75 billion rupees every fortnight. That's impossible effectively to keep. They're both not only just humongous, but they're also a very bad idea because you also import fuel. You don't want to incentivize increased consumption of it, but it's also very, very unfair, especially for poorer people who use less fuel, for the government to be giving a large chunk of its budget to subsidizing it. So that's what has to happen. And the reason why it has to happen, apart from all of these reasons around it being a bad idea and being a really big fiscal commitment for the government, it's also something which is going to be a prior action for the IMF. And that's the second thing which has to happen, that program has to restart. Some foreign exchange reserves have to come in because Pakistan's import cover is very, very low. And if we do the fuel subsidy decrease or outright elimination, and we go to the IMF and the talks in Doha are successful, we do get a bit more money, we get more certainty around the program, we will be able to raise more debt. It won't be easy because the macro conditions globally are very hard. But if we are able to raise some bilateral debt through Saudi Arabia and UAE and China, whether that includes rollover of loans, and raise some private sector debt from European bond markets or something like that, then it will stabilize. But what we're effectively looking at is stabilization again. Pakistan stabilizes its economy every 2-3 years, and that's exactly what we have to do again. And that's really painful for ordinary people who will face high inflation and very low growth over the coming few months, maybe a year or two.
Right, Farrukh Wani, later in the program, I would want you to actually address the issue of stabilization as well, why we have been struggling with it for decades and we haven't reached anywhere. But at this moment, I want to ask you to comment on how things are right now. Particularly this whole thing, the economic situation, reminds you of watching a train crash in slow-mo. And it continues no matter what. The concern at this moment, as you pointed out, is that everyone knows what is to be done, but sadly that hasn't been done. And that is perhaps because of the optics of it, because an election is coming, and whichever government actually implements this, they are going to perhaps bear the political cost as well. Do you think that there is a way to reconcile the two situations, or perhaps actually explain it to IMF that in the current atmospherics, it might not be possible given what is happening in Sri Lanka?
So I completely agree. I think it's largely politics. It's how the political management of it is quite hard to do. And that makes me, and that's one of the reasons I'm very critical of the previous administration too, that giving the subsidies made it if they were in the government, it would put themselves in an impossible situation, and they've also put their successors in an impossible situation. With the IMF, with the counterfaction is that you keep these subsidies, and that's 75 billion rupees. Eventually, then you won't be able to spend on almost anything else. You need to get the money from somewhere, and that's very hard. And then you need to get dollars from somewhere to pay for that fuel because you can't pay in rupees. So it's the reason why the IMF is asking us to do it is not because IMF is some sort of an exogenous character which is really has all of these sort of ideas which they want you to implement, but it's not really good for the country to keep these subsidies. The counterfactual, that's what I was thinking about the other day, was that you keep them and you're not able to raise enough foreign reserves, and you give away much of your federal budget into these subsidies. What do you want to do? You want to proceed towards a default? If you think this is going to be bad on inflation politics, a default will be much worse. Sri Lanka is going through a default. That's a much worse.
Do you honestly think that any political party or any political government is going to go ahead and do it? And do you think that there won't be any cost for them politically?
I will leave this to political scientists to answer, but in my view, there will be a cost, but the counterfactual is much more costly. It's not only costly for the political party, but it's costly for all of us. So that's right, where the tragedy lies.
Perhaps it's not just the political cost, it's also the cost of the people actually suffering, because a large portion of the population is also very poor. They're going to be depending on fuel as well. Our industries are also going to be depending on that as well. And a huge increase in the prices perhaps will not be in favor of the larger part of the population, and they'll really suffer. That's also perhaps a consideration of the government as well. And when we look at that, does this mean that what the IMF is expecting is perhaps realistic in that sense? Can Pakistan really afford to make that change? And if so, can we perhaps also opt for a gradual shift in the prices? Will that be something that can be negotiated with the IMF?
So two things. First, I want us to really understand the fact that we are providing the subsidy through public purse, there is a cost we're already paying for it. And that's not only the cost of the money we have to now raise through debt and repay back because the government has taken over this fiscal obligation, but also the government can't spend on, can't expand the BIS that much. It can't give,
right, I understand that.
Increase healthcare. So there's a cost there, and that's a tremendous cost. It's a fortnightly cost, it's 75 billion rupees. It's almost more than what the federal government gives to any province in the country. It's a lot of money which the government is committed to do. It's much more than the government can afford to do. So that's one cost we need to understand. The second, which I completely agree, you increase the fuel, there will be inflation. There's going to be a lag of bit, and then everything price goes up. But first, and then to mitigate that, perhaps the government can come up with a roadmap. It can try to decrease it in sort of different steps. It has to decrease them. And secondly, the government can redirect some of the money towards targeted support. It can increase cash transfers to the poorest people. It can perhaps make wherever there's public transport a bit cheaper. They can also experiment with other targeted approaches for low-income users. It won't be enough to cover the inflation impact. That's very, very hard and nearly policy-wise impossible to do. Yeah. But there is a way to do this, and I think it's important for the government to be honest with the people that what kind of fiscal obligation it has taken over and why it's unsustainable.
Yeah. Farrukh, if we look at previous 2 years, of course we know that these 2 years due to COVID, they were extraordinary years for the whole world. But of course, the most affected economies are the ones we call them, third world countries or the emerging economies. Of course, they were dented with this COVID-19. And if we talk about the economists, they believe that most of the countries that would be affected during the rehabilitation of the economies of the world, of course, them would be the underdeveloped countries like Pakistan, like Sri Lanka, all of these countries. So is there a realization within IMF regarding COVID-19 as well, that if all of these countries that were running themselves with the obviously democratic system and democracy is persisting in there, right now there is an SOS in all of these democratic countries regarding how the country should be governed. So shouldn't it be a realization and the extraordinary measures should be taken by IMF regarding all of these countries, and bailouts should be more easier to give to all of these countries?
And by the way, there was a bailout that was issued because of SDR. Why is it that SDR doesn't seem to have the kind of lasting impact we were expecting?
So it is true that the global market, especially for developing countries, have gone through a lot of stress over the past 2 years. And that hasn't ended so far because global market isn't really doing very well. The Fed rates are being hiked up. It's very hard. It's becoming harder to raise debt. Global growth is slowing down. And add to that, so the geopolitics of crisis in Ukraine and Russia, which has a significant impact particularly over food market. So all of that has created a really bad situation for emerging economies. The IMF and other global IFIs, we call them, international financial institutions, did provide some measures during the pandemic for targeted at developing countries. Pakistan also benefited from it, and it made financing easier. And of course, I think oil prices also went down, so that also provided support to oil importing countries. But one can argue, and I think I agree with this parameter, that there wasn't enough support provided to developing countries. Now, the problem with Pakistan right now is that we can argue with the IMF, and I think that the argument Dr. Miftah and his economic team will present in Doha, that it's politically challenging, and they might agree to some sort of a roadmap, but we can't at this point unilaterally try to push for greater support when the global market is in the position it is. We have to effectively get our house in order, and this is a problem which we have sort of underlying structural problems which have existed over decades, which make this crisis make us sort of so much prone to other crises. Other countries, a lot of them have gone through crisis, in part made worse by COVID. But not everyone has, and COVID was, like shocks, tend to be a stress test for these countries' institutions.
Mr. Farrukh, when you talk about getting our house in order, of course, there's a lot of talk with regards to the fuel subsidies as well. But are there any measures that can be urgently taken to help the situation at the moment?
And by the way, earlier you actually brought up the matter of targeted subsidies and actually passing on some kind of relief in other sectors. How, when you look at the way we actually provided cash directly to the, very poor and such targeted interventions, how do you assess the past experience of Pakistan?
And talking about the measures, could that measure be that a huge political decision right now can actually, wave off the uncertainties on our economy, like, going towards the election, or if the opposition party right now, that is PTI, it can, calm itself down?
So let me just, three things. So first, on the elections and sort of political uncertainty, it depends on what the interim government does. So one can argue that interim caretaker government is more likely to take sort of very tough austerity-like measures, and if that happens, that would provide some pathway. The problem right now is no one knows what's happening on the economic reform agenda, and very little people know that for how long the government is in place. So there's a lot of uncertainty around all of this. So if anything which reduces this uncertainty will be good. And then, of course, it depends then specifically on what the caretaker government does in between, and then how does the politics of the country shape up. So that's first. The second, on sort of targeted subsidies, Pakistan has it will need to be expanded, but it has a fairly decent infrastructure when it comes to providing cash transfers, which has been set up by 2008, 9, 10 onwards through BISP and then sort of the larger SAS infrastructure. But the underlying thing is called the NSCR, which is the National Socio-Economic Registry. So that was really useful during COVID. So the Pakistan had a fairly large sort of cash transfer program. It also provided some measures through the central bank to manufacturers. But that's something that the country can build upon and expand, and it should expand regardless of the fuel subsidies, because it's a very important job for the government to provide support for the poorest people in the country. And doing things like increasing fuel prices, that can be really helpful. Another thing which would be really helpful at this point would have been a really good public transport system in a major city, but we can't build that over a fortnight. So that's something we can't do. But that would have been really useful in providing targeted subsidy, because it can lower prices.
This idea, Farrukh, hang on.
Yeah.
This idea of actually providing targeted fuel subsidies as well to the very poor, or perhaps people who are using motorcycles or rickshaws for that matter, do you think that is a no-brainer?
It could work. It's something you have to set up. It will require setting up an entire institutional structure, but it's something the government can do, and then has to prevent leakages into that system. But if the government is committed and has a envelope and says, okay, it's 75 billion rupees every fortnight, which we can't afford, but we will give 10 billion rupees in subsidies for targeted people, let's say motorcycle users, there will be some leakage in that, but it can set up that infrastructure. It will require a lot of upfront costs for the government to set it up.
Farrukh, looking at the current political turmoil, of course, Pakistan is going through, of course, the Muslim countries and the friends of Pakistan, maybe they are not ready to trust Pakistan in terms of helping out, tackling with all of the problems which are being faced by Pakistan's economy right now. Do you think that if we had a caretaker set up, Pakistan as a state would be successful in having some sort of support from all of our friends?
And by the way, don't worry about the political tone in this question, because we Pakistanis have this obsession with politics, making everything about politics rather than economy. But the concern, the question is whether IMF will deal with a caretaker setup. That is also a question, is it not?
Exactly.
Yeah, so it tends not to. So especially when a new program is expanded, it tends to deal with governments which have sort of proper mandate. But there could be privileges provided in this case. The reason why we're unable to raise bilateral, first of all, if you're going to ask for a country for money, it's up to them to give you or not. But the reason why, from what I understand, they're not giving this money at this present is because they want us to get an AOK from IMF. And that also opens up other financiers. Because what the IMF does, apart from giving a bit of money, but it provides a credible commitment to the international market that this country is trying to put its house in order. Unless we have that, whatever the government is in place, it's immaterial. No one will be able to raise debt. So you need to raise this money. So that's,
right, Mr. Sharaf, another aspect, of course, which is important is, and that previous governments have also tried to work on, is, of course, to improve the import and export balance. And we understand that, of course, there's a huge increase in imports as well. And there have been measures on the table in terms of what can be done with regards to it. But do you think that there is something that is perhaps possible in the immediate or radical sense, where we immediately limit the import of perhaps our non-essential items so that we can quickly perhaps change the dollar or the kind of economic situation that we're currently in? Can that happen?
So I want us to recognize one thing. So first of all, Pakistan doesn't import a lot. Pakistan just doesn't export much less. So that's an underlying problem. So Pakistan's problem, and there's some people who often say this, that it's because a lot of people are buying imported products and really fancy stuff, fancy cheeses and things like that. That's not the case. Pakistan, look at the income group, it imports about average. And whenever we tax import, we also make exports harder because imports are not all finished products. They tend to feed into export supply chains. Everything is sort of linked together in the economy. So if we do anything on restricting imports, it will also have an impact on exports. So it's not, so the way the integrated global market works, it's not sort of that clear cut. It can consider some drastic import measures, but I want to be very sort of recognize the fact that that doesn't solve the problem. Then it might help us for like say 6 months or 12 months.
Right, but the kind of conditions that you're mentioning, can't they be looked at, and then perhaps a policy be made with reference to what sort of imports are affecting our exports as well, and what items can be targeted?
And
So-
what imports are actually impacting our current account or balance of payment at this moment? Because there is a truckload of SROs that are there, exemptions are there.
Yeah, so the biggest import in Pakistan is fuel, and that sort of brings us back to the subsidy point. But and that if you restrict imports of fuel, then you're going to slow down the entire economy. You might end up slowing down the economy. You can't do that, and that's what stabilization does: is that you decrease economic growth to bring your deficit in order, and that's effectively. If you reduce growth, imports will also go down because people will have less money to buy stuff. So that's something you can do, and that's something governments have done in the past. And they can take, this government can take some drastic measures in doing targeted reductions in imports. But it has to consider some WTO rules around that, and it also has to consider the larger impacts on the economy, which won't be good. So there will be adverse impacts. Just to get the deficit in order, you can make those measures. But then I really think the government needs to think about why its exports aren't competitive, why firms aren't incentivized enough to export, why there's a misallocation of capital within the economy, why can't Pakistani firms compete with Vietnamese and Bangladeshi firms in the global market? Unless we solve those problems, it's not going to really help. And that's something which the government, it might not be able to do anything. And we always end up firefighting in Pakistan, right? There's always a fire out, and we never sort of focus on why a house is burning every 3 years. So unless we start thinking about that and start bringing sort of political consensus around sort of these drastic economic measures you need to fix the country's underlying economic problems, then we will be back.
That's a good point. Farrukh, that is a good point. But how? The question is how? Because repeatedly, you were right when earlier you were talking about stabilization and structural problems in our state or a government machinery, but they have been there for quite some time. I remember 80s, we used to talk about structural reforms, and repeatedly we have been talking about them, but that doesn't seem to work. Do you think that at this moment, this idea of stabilization is even possible?
So stabilization is, Pakistan stabilizes, Pakistan knows how to stabilize the economy because people suffer, but you can do sort of the macro measures and stabilize, your imports go down because your economy is overheating, so you reduce sort of growth and you're able to take loans and this and that, and you can stabilize. Stabilization isn't that hard to do. It's just a lot of painful decisions to take. But if you take them, you do stabilize the economy. Structural reforms is hard because structural reforms are deeply political, and you need to have some sort of political capital to undertake those. And that's a sort of a larger issue in the economy, which we have to do. And you're very correct. These problems have existed decades on decades, and that's why Pakistan goes to the IMF every few years. But at some point, someone has to fix those problems, and we have to do something different.
Let me give you very quickly two examples of a problem where we have actual structural issues. What do you propose to do with both of these? One, circular debt. It keeps on piling on, and we cannot do much about it because we keep on importing more fuel. And secondly, when you talk about SOEs, they are there. They keep on eating all the money of this public. What do you do with both?
I will leave circular debt there, but what I want to say is that and SOEs too. So the problem here is, of course, politics. You know what you have to do. For instance, take SOEs. If you want to privatize SOEs, which I think the government should do, because the government, if you can't run police stations and schools, you shouldn't be running a steel mill. That's not your job, and you're also intervening in the market where you don't have to. But again, the reason you don't do it is because you need to build enough political capital to take these decisions, because there's someone who's benefiting from the current system, and you need to take on them, and you need to build a coalition to undertake those reforms successfully. And the fact is that I don't even think the SOEs and so-called debt, while they're both really big issues and feed into take away from public finances, what's even a bigger issue is the fact that Pakistan's economy is structured in a way which incentivizes firms not to build export competitive capacity. And that requires even bigger reforms and bigger sort of thoughts behind it. How do you get growth? How do you get productivity levels up? So
and
even when
more
we talk
money
about
also. And more money as well.
Yeah, you need more money, but you can always reform. You can undertake tax reforms. There's something, again, tax reforms in Pakistan. Pakistan doesn't tax enough. It's not only about sort of what FBR can do, but it's also because you need to then tax stuff which is costly to tax, because there will be people who will be really angry.
Farrukh,
Yes,
just
quickly,
last question.
Faisal.
Yeah, last question. I understand that you have extensively worked with Dr. Adil Malik, especially related to sugar crisis of Pakistan or sugar industry of Pakistan, and that has a lot to do, of course, with Afghanistan as well. My question here is the current turmoil, the economic turmoil Pakistan is facing. How much is the Afghan factor or Afghanistan factor affecting that, and the current duress? Does it has a lot to do with Afghanistan?
I don't think so. I think this is largely Pakistan's own creation. This is entirely Pakistan. Pakistan deserves entire credit for the mess we are in right now. It's entirely, the current mess is, the immediate reason is because entirely of fuel subsidies, which have sort of created this fiscal obligation domestically and has made it hard to raise capital from externally, so you don't have enough dollars to pay for exports.
Right, absolutely, Farrukh. We're almost out of time for this segment. My last question is with reference to, are we losing time in any way in terms of making a decision right now? Of course, there is the urgent consequence, but in terms of recovery, are we going to have long-lasting impact on the way our economy is going to go ahead, that we'll need perhaps more time to recover, or any damaging aspects to the economy that perhaps will not be able to reverse itself?
And I didn't catch your answer regarding SOEs. What do you propose? Should we actually divest or do something else?
Oh, you should privatize, period. You should sell them, whatever, because they're fiscal obligation, which the government can't afford and shouldn't be doing anyways. And they can think about different SOEs differently, slightly, but they have to be invest in them. On the point about, are we losing? We are losing time. So we are losing a lot of time because we need effectively dollars to pay for imports, and we're going to run out of dollars if we don't have sort of significant capital injection through the debt market or through the IMF. So we are losing time on that, and we're also creating a lot of uncertainty in the domestic market. So that's why the stock exchange is sort of has decreased in value. That's why dollar is going up, because there's a lot of uncertainty. And what we don't think about is that more we wait, that means you're giving up on growth. You're reducing your growth. You're reducing prosperity for people. You could be focused more specifically in getting stabilization done as quickly as possible, and then move towards providing some sort of framework for growth and productivity for people of Pakistan.
Absolutely.
So people's
Thank you
incomes
very
rise.
much. Thank you very much, Mr. Farrukh Wani, for joining us. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Yes, Farrukh.
Thank you very much.
I very quickly actually wanted to point out the voices that keep on coming from various political sides. And I think I'll take you back to Asif Ali Zardari's presser, in which he actually pointed out that you'll have to think out of the box. And amazingly, while we keep on accusing People's Party of adhering to this socialist model, he actually came out of the way and he said that Pakistan should start divesting as quickly as possible. I think at this moment, the amount that we pay to the public sector enterprises, SOEs, that is so big that you'll have to start divesting just now. And I think it is welcome if it is coming from People's Party.
Right, and we hope that it does come soon because, of course,
Yeah,
this uncertainty is looming, and we need to do something about it. When we talk about the situation in Palestine, which is part of our second segment, this, of course, is something that is of concern for Pakistan, for people all around the world, where, of course, such atrocities exist. And we've seen that in the recent days, the situation has deteriorated even further. To talk about the situation in Palestine, we've been joined online by Mr. Haitham Nasser, who is a Palestinian journalist. Thank you very much for joining us online and being a part of the debate. Of course, in the unfortunate events in the recent past in Palestine, we've seen the atrocities that have been carried out by Israeli occupation forces. And of course, the murder of Shirin Abu Akleh has also been something that has been part of the news. Unfortunately, still, it has been reported differently in different parts of the world. And perhaps the kind of consequence or impact that it required from the international community was not really given. And we all understand why it has been done in the past as well. But this, of course, means that however much the situation actually deteriorates, even if funerals are targeted by occupation forces around the world, there's going to be nothing much that is going to be done by countries unless they're interested in doing something about it. What can be done in terms of making sure that this issue, like the previous ones or the previous incidents that have happened in Palestine, do not just go back in the background and people just forget about Shirin or the rest who have been targeted?
Thank you for having me. First of all, it needs the political will. There is no political will, neither in the Palestinian Authority leadership nor in the Arab countries, including Qatar, who was hiring Shirin Abu Akleh before she was assassinated, and other countries in the region, not Islamic countries, not OIC. Nobody is interested to have a more brave reaction against Israel, except announcing this street named after her, or this scholarship book, new female journalists after her. So every week there are at least 4 to 5 civilian Palestinians killed. Nobody cares, while it's a totally different story when we talk about civilians in any other part of the world. So this international community reaction to Palestinian issue is controlled by the influence of Israel in international community, especially in America and other main headquarters in Europe and China, even Russia. They have a big influence. That's why it's very slow reaction from international community. From Arab and Islamic countries, there is no much political leadership to take steps.
Please go ahead.
There is also the issue, of course, of the way that these aspects are reported and the way that then they are perceived. There's, of course, a lot of stories that have been shared by news agencies around the world who have sort of painted perhaps a different picture with a slight change of words. But that, of course, has huge impacts in the way that they are perceived by the international community. And somehow or the other, it seems that the issues or the people in Palestine or in other parts of the world are just not as important or are viewed fundamentally differently than in areas in the other parts of the world. How can perhaps work be done in terms of making sure that the language that is used or the way that such incidents are talked about is different and more relevant for the people around the world?
I think this is the side issue. It became a main topic in many discussion on social media and some news agencies, because the activists who are supporting Palestine in Western countries try to use this as an argument against the media outlets there. But if you don't have ethics in the political decision making, how do you expect ethics, either journalistic ethics or any types of ethics in the media? So if that's lacking in every other decision-making process, it will be same in media.
And that is absolutely spot on, Mr. Nasser. Edward Said, actually himself a Palestinian, even wrote a book called Covering Islam, and he focused also on how Palestine is covered. But let me ask you about another very important thing. Regardless of apartheid government in Israel and how it actually manages things, the concern at this moment is that when you look at the overall narrative, it is either black or white. nobody looks at the gray and where we can actually have any kind of targeted intervention. For example, wherever police have been militarized or military has been used to fill in as a substitute for police, we have seen similar kind of scenes. Particularly that scene was really harrowing in the funeral, where funeral goers were actually being beaten,
Right.
and the coffin actually fell. At this moment, is it not important to engage with the people or the forces that this kind of behavior of policing and treating Palestinians as inferior will not work, and there has to be a solution to this as well?
The first part of your statement is valid. It can work, but for decreasing the violence from the police. But as for finding a solution, I think this is a very long shot. What I mean to say is Israeli officials themselves admitted that this behavior from our policemen have affected our image. They know it wasn't right to do. But are they, Israeli authorities, are they interested to find a solution to Palestinian or admit their other crimes? There have been a lot of investigation committees sent by UN, sent by a lot of other organizations in the past. But Israel did not listen to any of those conclusions. They did not admit their mistakes. They refused any hearing in the international courts, and nobody is there to pressurize them politically to do so. So if you don't feel,
Haytham, if we look at our recent past, of course, if a journalist gets persecuted in a Muslim country, by a Muslim country, or within a Muslim country, consequences are different. Suddenly what we see is, even the foreign policy is affected, even the mightiest leadership of the world is talking about it, because there are international journalistic organizations who have a very good lobbying within the Western governments. So what we see is that it always takes place, and of course we know that politically and foreign policy of a country gets affected by it. But here we are, and sometimes we saw that sanctions even were imposed on the countries related to that. But here we are, constantly we're seeing the journalists are being persecuted by Israel and nothing take place. There is another news today that a vigil was called in Germany, which is obviously not accepted by Germany, and it is not being allowed inside Germany against Israel and whatever happened to Shirin. Don't you think that there are double standards which are being constantly sort of practiced by the Westerners, and even the organizations, the international journalistic organizations? They are not looking into it. They're not using the lobbies which they normally use for Muslim countries. They're not using it against Israel.
And this question actually gave me another one, that is about the Western experience with anti-Semitism, right? Because of that, Germany and countries like that are sensitive. But how do you actually convince them that what Israel is doing, criticism of their atrocities, is not anti-Semitism?
Exactly.
It is primarily a country actually overreaching and killing people.
Humanity.
Okay. The first part is why the international community related to journalism, organizations or foreign policy, they're using sanctions against some other countries, but we don't see this against Israel. Let's ask ourselves, who used these tools as a foreign policy tools? It's America. America does use this as a foreign policy tool against weaker countries or opposite side countries. They don't use it when a journalist in Finland or a journalist in Denmark is doing something against his own government, and the government is killing him or torturing him. They use it in weak countries, mostly Islamic countries or Asian countries, to pressurize that country. We have seen this with Iran, with other countries too. And the second part, or media organizations need to do more. Yes, I said Al Jazeera, Qatar did not do enough after Shireen assassination, and this underlying assassination. She wasn't killed by mistake. She was killed because there was a decision to kill. The second part, which is how the media is covering, we need a better narration, etc., etc. Of course, there is no neutrality, the narration, but this is old news. This is the same what we talk about Kashmir and how it's covered in UN, not even in NGOs or media outlets. Even in UN, you don't have neutrality. You don't have a proper process of taking decisions. So do you expect that from international organizations of media? There is the same influence. If you can influence the White House and the American president said, oh, I don't know the detailed information about Shireen Abu Akleh. In this case, he doesn't know that detailed information.
Right.
But in other cases, he will tell you the entire story. So this is influence.
And Mr. Nasser, I understand that, but when we also look at the situation in Palestine and other parts of the world, there's also there's a lot of variables involved which can be played by many different parties. And we've also seen in the issue of Palestine as well that there has been a lot of talk with reference to both parties also avoiding conflict and sort of changing the narrative from one party being extensively hostile towards the other and occupying a foreign land and just changing that into something which perhaps is happening on an equal plane when it's not. But then this, of course, blurs the lines in which we can actually look for justice, especially for people like Shiri or any other individual. It's hard to be able to pinpoint something as absolutely wrong and then to have a consequence for that. Can there be any incidents of crimes in certain countries, or can there be bodies or platforms which can be targeted for such incidents and only look at what's going on in terms of something being a crime? For example, the funeral that was targeted, it has to be something that needs to be wrong in every aspect, right? So how are we able to pursue that irrespective of the political situation or the narratives of different countries?
And by the way, just to qualify what you were saying, Sana, one example, and that was really annoying, was whatever happened just now. Actually, it was being referred to as clashes between the two sides. This both sidism has to end because one side is actually perpetrating all these atrocities. Why not report it that way?
Yes, this needs also a political will. If you remember, there was a ship from Turkey, Mr. Talat Hussein, one of Pakistani journalists, joined that to go and help Palestinians before a few years. Who drove the narration about that incident? It was Turkey, because it started from there. Politically, Turkey supported that narration until there was justice served to all those who were on the ship, despite the fact that Israeli killed Turkish citizens, they killed Palestinian citizens, they killed international activists. If you have one state wants to use the political tools, either media or other tools, it can be used. But if you don't have the political will, because we know that international media outlets, they are either funded or partially with a partnership with some state, one state or another. So do you expect international media from America or from Europe to go against their state policies and cover something neutrally?
No, but there were examples, right? There were examples. For example, when Gaza war was going on, or invasion of Gaza was going on under Netanyahu, they actually destroyed a building, Al Jazeera building, and that AP actually called it out.
In Gaza, it was Associated Press office, and yet Associated Press agency did not report that incident neutrally. How do you understand that? Because there is an influence on the editor or in the editorial decision in Associated Press. Even when they are attacked, Jazeera, let's say it's an Arabic or Islamic, from an Islamic country. Associated Press is Western. Nobody claimed that they were.
Haytham, being a journalist. Being a journalist, there is something I want to share with you, and I just want a one-liner from you. New York Times, of course, you consider it and I consider it something which always need to be followed, the journalism they follow. But here it is, Shireen Abu Akleh, trailblazing Palestinian journalist, dies at 51. Dies at 51. How do you see it being a journalist?
From ethical perspective, as a journalist, it's illogical. How did it make sense to an editor or a reporter to write this title? It's illogical because the facts are there. Even if you didn't see the shooting or anything, there is not a single news came from Shirin Abu Akleh assassination that says she died peacefully in her bed or in the hospital even after injury. She died on the spot. She was killed.
Sana, with your
And
permission, I have
it
to
is-
ask a question. And this question is directed to our friend Faisal, because he actually presented a binary, right? And that binary is important, but I want to understand the direction. Earlier, when you were talking about Faisal, regarding how consequences are different for Muslim countries or poor countries or countries which the West doesn't own, and consequences are different for countries like Israel. Now the question at this moment is which example is rather better, where everyone faces consequences when media liberties are actually violated, or whether like Israel, the Western media or Western bodies should actually turn a blind eye to the other countries as well. I ask this because New York Times and publications like them are not popular either in Israel, because they keep on calling out Israeli government as well in the past, and that's why they have to actually go for this tightrope walking.
Yeah, Farrukh, to me, I think even New York Times, which is considered as a champion of freedom of press in the world, it has the red lines which is being followed by them.
This is not my question. My question is, which example would you go for? Do you want more exemptions for countries all over the world, including Muslim countries, where they can do whatever they want to with media? Or do you want these exemptions in Israel to go away?
I would follow the statement which you were earlier mentioning before the program, and you said that journalism is all about bringing forth the truth.
Yeah.
It is all about truth. To me, I think they should be following just the truth. There is something going wrong within the Muslim world, they should be calling it out.
All right.
I get it.
I think
media crackdown should be avoided everywhere.
Not at all.
Crackdown has to be avoided, right?
All right, we'll continue the discussion after the show as well. Farrukh, thank you very much, Hazem Nasir, for joining us and being a part of the debate. And of course, we all hope and pray, and our hearts go out to the people who are suffering in Palestine, not just Shireen's family, but the rest as well. And we really hope that something is done about it, and that voices are actually heard by the people who are sitting at the tables where decisions are made, and they actually do something right for the people who are suffering right now all over the world. Thank you for watching the debate. We'll see you tomorrow.